The city was divided, not by walls of brick or stone, but by invisible lines etched into the hearts of its people. On one side, the Black City sprawled, a place of resilience and struggle, where its inhabitants fought to rise above years of neglect and injustice. Crumbling buildings lined the narrow streets, their walls adorned with vibrant murals that told stories of hope and defiance. Children played barefoot on sidewalks cracked by time, their laughter masking the weight of a history that seemed impossible to escape. This was a city of survivors, people who had nothing handed to them, but still managed to carve out lives from the harshest of circumstances. On the other side, the White City gleamed like a polished diamond, its towering skyscrapers stretching toward the heavens as if to claim dominion over the world below. The streets here were pristine, flanked by manicured trees and glimmering storefronts. People walked with a sense of purpose, their confidence bolstered by the privileges they had come to expect as natural. It was a place of abundance, of progress, but also of blind complacency. Few here thought about the struggles on the other side of the divide. Fewer still cared to understand. The two cities coexisted uneasily, their proximity a daily reminder of a world built on imbalance. The Black City saw the White City as a symbol of everything it had been denied: opportunity, power, respect. The White City viewed its counterpart with a mix of pity and suspicion, an entity that could never quite be welcomed into its shimmering fold. For years, this fragile equilibrium held, as though both sides had accepted their roles in a story neither had written. But that balance was about to shatter. The spark came in the form of a tragedy. A young boy from the Black City, no older than 14, found lifeless at the border between the two worlds. His name was Malik, and he had dreams too big for the streets that tried to confine him. He often spoke of becoming a lawyer, of one day standing in courtrooms and demanding justice for people like his mother, who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. His death sent shockwaves through the Black City, where grief quickly gave way to anger. How had this happened? Who was responsible? And why was no one in the White City willing to answer those questions? Among those mourning, Malik was his older sister, Amara. At 25, she had already seen more hardship than most people could imagine. But this was different. Malik was her reason for waking up each morning, the one she had protected since the day he was born. Now she was left with nothing but his memory and a burning need for answers. Amara's rage became a rallying cry, her voice rising above the despair that had settled over her community. "We've been silent for too long," she told the crowd gathered at a vigil for Malik. "If they won't give us justice, we'll demand it ourselves." The White City, for its part, dismissed the incident as unfortunate but isolated. Its leaders assured their constituents that everything was under control, that the system would take care of things. But Amara and her people knew better. They had seen what happened when justice was left to a system designed to overlook them. They had no faith in promises or platitudes. They wanted action. One man who watched the unfolding events with a wary eye was Adrian, a councilman in the White City with ambitions of climbing even higher. Adrian had built his career on the idea that unity was possible, but the divide between the two cities could be bridged. But even he couldn't deny the growing tensions. He attended meeting after meeting, listening to his colleagues to discuss how to contain the unrest spilling over from the Black City. No one seemed interested in addressing the root causes. No one seemed to care that Malik's death was more than a tragedy. It was a symbol of everything wrong with their society. As protests swelled and anger mounted, the two cities found themselves hurtling toward confrontation. Amara became a figurehead for the movement, her fiery speeches drawing crowds that filled entire blocks. "We are not asking for your permission to exist," she declared at one rally. "We are demanding the freedom to thrive." Meanwhile, Adrian found himself torn between his loyalty to the White City and his growing unease with its indifference. He began to ask questions no one wanted to answer. Why was the border between the cities so heavily policed? Why did the White City hoard resources while the Black City struggled to provide even the basics for its people? The more he dug, the more he realized that the system he had worked so hard to succeed in was the very thing keeping the two cities at odds. Amara and Adrian's paths were destined to cross, though neither could have imagined how much was at stake. For Amara, the fight was deeply personal, a quest for justice, not just for Malik, but for everyone who had been overlooked and oppressed. For Adrian, it was a reckoning with his own complicity, a chance to decide which side of history he wanted to stand on. As the two cities braced for what felt like an inevitable clash, the question loomed: could two worlds so divided ever find common ground? Or was the fight for freedom destined to tear them apart? The answer lay ahead, in the choices they would make and the battles they would face. But one thing was certain: the story of the Black City and the White City was far from over, and neither would ever be the same again. The tension in the air was palpable, spreading like an unspoken epidemic through both cities. In the Black City, there was a sense of urgency, an understanding that this moment could not pass quietly. This was their time to be heard, to be seen, to be acknowledged. The older generation, weary from years of broken promises and systemic neglect, looked on with cautious hope as the younger voices like Amara's took the lead. For them, this was more than just about Malik. It was about breaking a cycle that had stolen too many sons, daughters, and dreams. Amara walked the streets she knew so well, her mind racing. Every corner of the Black City held memories, some warm, like Malik laughing as they shared ice cream on a hot summer day, and others heavy, like the night their mother came home crying because her paycheck wasn't enough to cover the bills. Amara had grown up in this city, seen its struggles, and understood its heart. But now, she felt the weight of something larger. She wasn't just fighting for her brother anymore, she was fighting for an entire community that had been pushed to its limits. Across the divide, Adrian sat alone in his sleek office, the city's skyline glittering through the massive windows behind him. The White City always looked perfect at night, as if the darkness only served to enhance its glow. But tonight, that perfection felt hollow. Adrian couldn't stop thinking about the faces he had seen on the news, the voices demanding justice. He had seen Amara speak, her words raw and cutting. She didn't just call out the injustice, she made you feel it. Adrian didn't know her personally, but he couldn't shake the way her passion seemed to radiate through the screen. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. His colleagues had spent the day crafting statements, carefully worded declarations meant to pacify the situation without committing to real action. But Adrian knew the truth. Words weren't going to be enough this time. The Black City had heard all the apologies and condolences before. They weren't looking for sympathy. They were demanding change, and Adrian wasn't sure his city was ready to give it to them. The divide between the two cities wasn't new. It had been there for decades, growing wider with each passing year. What had started as a simple disparity in resources had become something far more ingrained, a cultural and social chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The Black City had always been treated as the other side, a place to avoid, a problem to solve. Its people were spoken of in terms of statistics and stereotypes, never as individuals with hopes, dreams, and stories of their own. Adrian had been raised to believe in meritocracy, in the idea that hard work and determination could take you anywhere. It was a comforting narrative, one that allowed him to justify his own success. But now he couldn't ignore the cracks in that story. How could you work hard when the system was stacked against you from the start? How could you dream big when even walking into the White City felt like an act of defiance? These questions gnawed at him, challenging everything he thought he knew. Meanwhile, Amara was assembling a coalition. Her energy was infectious, drawing people from all corners of the Black City. Activists, artists, teachers, and even a few disillusioned former police officers joined her cause. They set up makeshift headquarters in an old community center, its peeling paint and creaky floors a testament to years of neglect. But the people inside didn't care about appearances. They were united by a common purpose, a shared understanding that this was their moment to fight for something better. Among them was an older man named Samuel, a retired factory worker who had lived in the Black City his entire life. Samuel had seen the cycles of protests and promises, the fleeting moments of hope that always seemed to end in disappointment. But he believed in Amara. "You've got fire, girl," he told her one night as they worked late into the evening. "Just make sure you use it to light the way, not burn everything down." Back in the White City, Adrian found himself at odds with his colleagues. During a meeting to discuss the ongoing protests, he spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "We can't keep treating this as just another disturbance to manage," he said. "This is bigger than one incident. This is about years of inequality, of systemic failure. If we don't address that, this isn't going to go away." His words were met with silence, followed by a few murmurs of disapproval. One council member, an older man with a reputation for pragmatism, dismissed Adrian's concerns. "It's not our job to fix their problems," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "Our job is to maintain order." Adrian clenched his fists under the table, anger bubbling beneath his composed exterior. He wanted to argue, to make them see what he was beginning to understand, but he knew it would be futile. The White City's leaders were too entrenched in their own comfort, too disconnected from the reality on the other side of the divide. As the days passed, the tension between the two cities grew. Protests in the Black City became larger and more organized, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for Malik," they cried, their voices a chorus of pain and determination. The White City responded with increased police presence, their uniforms and riot shields a stark reminder of the power imbalance at play. Amara watched the news coverage with a mix of frustration and resolve. The media in the White City painted her as a troublemaker, a provocateur stirring up unrest. But she refused to be silenced. "They can call me whatever they want," she told her supporters. "What matters is that we don't stop, not until they listen." Adrian, too, was watching. He saw the same footage, heard the same rhetoric, and felt a growing sense of unease. The more he learned about the Black City and its people, the harder it became to ignore their plight. He began to spend his evenings poring over reports, reading about the history of the divide, the policies that had created it, and the people who had suffered because of it. And the more he read, the more he realized how complicit he had been, not just in his silence, but in his acceptance of a system that had failed so many. One night, unable to sleep, Adrian drove to the edge of the White City, stopping just short of the border. He sat in his car, staring out at the lights of the Black City in the distance. It was a world he had been taught to fear, a place he had been told was dangerous and chaotic. But now he saw it differently. It wasn't chaos, it was struggle. It wasn't danger, it was desperation. And it wasn't a world apart. It was a reflection of everything his own city had refused to acknowledge. As he sat there, he made a decision, one that would change everything. Adrian knew he couldn't fix the divide on his own, but he also knew he couldn't stand by any longer. It was time to cross the line, to step into the unknown and find out what it meant to truly fight for justice. And so, with a deep breath, Adrian started his car and drove toward the Black City. As Adrian's car crossed into the Black City, he couldn't help but notice how the world around him changed. The streets seemed narrower, the buildings older, their facades worn by years of neglect. Yet, despite the stark differences, there was a heartbeat here, a raw energy he hadn't felt in the sterile order of the White City. People were out on their porches, talking in groups, their voices carrying a mix of frustration, determination, and the kind of hope that comes from refusing to give up. Adrian's stomach tightened as he drove further in, unsure of how he would be received. He was, after all, a man of the White City, a place that had become synonymous with privilege and oppression in the eyes of many here. Adrian parked his car outside the old community center he'd seen on the news. It was late, but the lights were still on, and a faint hum of voices spilled out onto the street. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, Amara and her team were deep in discussion, maps and papers spread across a worn table in the center of the room. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of their mission hanging heavy over everyone present. When Adrian entered, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, a stranger in an expensive suit, clearly out of place. Amara's gaze was the sharpest of all, her dark eyes narrowing as she stood, arms crossed. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone cautious but firm. Adrian hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "My name is Adrian," he said finally. "I'm a councilman from the White City. I came here because I think we need to talk." The night before the press conference, the atmosphere in the community center was electric with tension. Amara and Adrian sat across from each other, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on them. The evidence they had gathered was irrefutable, but they both understood the risks involved in exposing the truth. It wasn't just Malik's story they were telling. It was the story of an entire city that had been silenced for too long. This wasn't just about justice for one man. It was about dismantling a system that had kept the Black City on its knees. Samuel paced the room, his usual calm demeanor replaced by restless energy. "You know they're not going to take this lying down," he said, his voice low. "The people in power, they'll come at us with everything they've got. Are we ready for that?" Amara didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice," she said firmly. "This is bigger than any of us. If we back down now, we're telling them they can keep doing this, that they can keep erasing us." Adrian nodded, though he couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had spent the day trying to gauge the temperature in the White City's political circles, and the reaction had been exactly what he feared: denial, deflection, and thinly veiled threats. One of his colleagues had pulled him aside after a meeting, his tone a mix of concern and warning. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Adrian," the man had said. "These people, they don't play fair. Walk away while you still can." But Adrian couldn't walk away. Not now. He had seen too much, learned too much. The truth was no longer something he could ignore or bury. The images of Malik's final moments haunted him, and the voices of the Black City's residents echoed in his mind. This fight wasn't just theirs, it was his too. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Amara gathered everyone for one final discussion. The room was packed with people, activists, community leaders, and residents who had come to lend their support. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavily in the air, but there was also a sense of unity, a shared determination that made the tension almost bearable. "Tomorrow," Amara began, her voice steady but charged with emotion, "we're not just telling Malik's story. We're telling the story of every person who has been denied justice, every family that has been torn apart, every dream that has been crushed by a system that sees us as less than human. This isn't just about exposing the truth, it's about reclaiming our power." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, but the weight of what lay ahead was impossible to ignore. Adrian stepped forward, feeling the need to speak. "I know I'm not from here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I know that, for a long time, I was part of the system that kept you down. But I'm here now because I believe that change is possible. I believe that what we're doing tomorrow can be the start of something bigger. But we have to be ready for backlash, for resistance. We have to be ready to stand our ground." Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "We're ready," she said. "We've been ready for a long time." As the meeting broke up, people lingered in the community center, reluctant to leave. The streets outside felt dangerous, charged with an energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. Adrian found himself standing by the window, looking out at the city he had come to know so intimately over the past weeks. The Black City wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of resilience, of a community that had refused to be broken despite everything. But as he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and felt his heart sink. The message was anonymous, short, and chilling. "Stay out of this. Last warning." He showed it to Amara, who barely reacted. "They're scared," she said simply. "Good, that means we're doing something right." Despite her calm exterior, Amara knew the risks were escalating. She had seen how power operated, how far it would go to protect itself. And as much as she hated to admit it, she worried for Adrian. He wasn't used to this kind of fight, to the shadows where threats turned into actions. But he had chosen to stand with them, and for that she respected him. The next morning, the community center was buzzing with activity. Reporters from both cities had been invited to the press conference, and the turnout was larger than anyone had expected. Cameras were being set up, microphones tested. The residents of the Black City had come out in full force, their presence a silent testament to their determination. But not everyone was pleased. A line of police officers stood at the edge of the crowd, their presence a stark reminder of the tension that hung over the event. Adrian noticed how many of them avoided making eye contact, their faces set in stone. He wondered how many of them truly believed in what they were being asked to do, and how many were just following orders. As the press conference began, Amara took the stage, her presence commanding. She started by recounting Malik's story, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She spoke of his dreams, his struggles, and the systemic forces that had ultimately taken his life. Then she turned to the evidence, laying out the facts with precision and clarity. Adrian watched as the crowd hung on her every word, their anger and grief simmering just beneath the surface. But as she reached the climax of her speech, a commotion broke out at the edge of the crowd. Adrian turned to see a group of men in plain clothes pushing their way toward the stage. Their intentions were clear, their movements calculated. The police didn't intervene. If anything, they seemed to step aside, creating a path for the intruders. Amara saw them too, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her voice, addressing the crowd. "This is what they do," she said, her tone defiant. "They try to silence us. They try to intimidate us. But we will not be silenced. Not today, not ever." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy a shield against the encroaching threat. Adrian felt a surge of adrenaline as he stepped closer to the stage, ready to intervene if necessary. The men hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered. But the tension didn't dissipate. It only grew, hanging over the crowd like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. As the tension in the crowd reached a boiling point, Amara held her ground, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The group of men hesitated, their confidence faltering as the sheer number of people surrounding them became impossible to ignore. The air was thick with a mixture of defiance and fear, the kind of energy that could shift in an instant. Adrian scanned the faces around him, searching for anything that might indicate what would happen next. He could see it in the eyes of the people. This wasn't just a protest. This was personal. And then it happened. From somewhere near the back of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. It was an older man, his weathered face etched with years of struggle. He was someone Adrian recognized from earlier meetings, a quiet presence who rarely spoke but always listened. The man raised his voice, and though it was strained with age, it carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around him. "You think you can scare us?" he called out, his gaze fixed on the group of intruders. "You think your threats and your badges will stop us? We've been living with fear our whole lives. But now we have nothing to lose. You can try to tear us down, but we will rise again, every time, because this city is ours, and no one can take that from us." The crowd erupted in applause, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to push the intruders back. But Adrian noticed something unsettling. A man in the group reached into his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. Adrian's stomach twisted with unease. He instinctively moved closer to the stage, positioning himself between Amara and the advancing threat. Before he could act, a sharp whistle cut through the air. It came from the opposite side of the crowd, drawing everyone's attention. A young boy, no older than 13, stood on top of a nearby car, his small frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He pointed toward the skyline of the white city, visible in the distance, and shouted, "They're coming." Confusion rippled through the crowd as people turned to look. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs was speeding toward the community center, their dark windows gleaming ominously. Adrian's heart sank. This wasn't just a few agitators sent to intimidate them. This was a full-scale operation. Amara saw it too, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She turned to Adrian, her voice urgent but steady. "We have to keep everyone calm," she said. "If this turns into chaos, they'll use it against us. We can't give them that power." Adrian nodded, though he had no idea how they were supposed to defuse a situation that was spiraling out of control. The SUVs came to a screeching halt, and men in tactical gear poured out, their faces hidden behind masks. They moved with military precision, fanning out to surround the crowd. The tension shifted in an instant, fear now overtaking defiance. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker, cold and commanding. "This gathering is unauthorized. Disperse immediately, or we will be forced to take action." Adrian felt his pulse quicken. This was a blatant show of force, meant to intimidate and suppress. He glanced at Amara, who stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "This is a peaceful assembly," she called out, her voice ringing with authority. "We have the right to be here. We have the right to speak. You can't silence us." Before Amara could respond, a voice from within the crowd shouted, "We're not going anywhere." It was followed by a chorus of agreement, the people refusing to be cowed. Adrian felt a swell of pride, but it was quickly tempered by the reality of the situation. The tension was a powder keg, and one wrong move could ignite it. And then, just as it seemed the standoff might break into violence, a second whistle pierced the air. This time, it came from the opposite side of the crowd. Adrian turned, his eyes widening as he saw another group approaching. But these weren't reinforcements for the tactical unit. They were residents of the Black City, marching together in a show of solidarity. They carried signs and banners, their voices rising in a unified chant. No justice, no peace. The sight of them sent a jolt of energy through the crowd, their courage a reminder of what they were fighting for. But the arrival of the marchers also escalated the stakes. The tactical unit was now outnumbered, and Adrian could see the tension in their movements. They weren't used to being challenged like this, and it showed. The leader of the unit raised his hand, signaling his men to prepare for action. Amara stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is our city," she said, her tone fierce. "You don't get to come in here and tell us to be silent. We've been silent for too long. But no more. We're done being afraid." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that couldn't be ignored. The leader of the tactical unit hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. For a moment, it seemed like he might stand down. But then, from the distance, a sharp crack echoed through the air. It was the sound of something breaking, glass, maybe, or a barricade. It wasn't clear where it had come from, but it was enough to shatter the fragile balance of the moment. The crowd tensed, their fear now mingled with anger. Adrian's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. But before he could make sense of it, chaos erupted. The tactical unit moved in, their shields raised, while the crowd surged forward, their voices a roar of defiance. In the midst of the chaos, Adrian caught a glimpse of something, or someone, that made his blood run cold. It was a face he recognized, one he hadn't seen in years. The man was standing on the edge of the crowd, watching everything unfold with a faint, almost satisfied smile. Adrian's heart pounded as he tried to piece it together. What was he doing here? And more importantly, what did he want? The questions swirled in his mind, but there was no time for answers. The battle for freedom had truly begun, and the stakes had never been higher. Adrian's eyes locked onto the man again, his heart racing as the crowd surged forward, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might snap. The man's presence, standing there like a silent observer, was like a cold weight in the pit of Adrian's stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random agitator, it was too deliberate. This man was here for a reason, and as the crowd's fury boiled over, it seemed like that reason was finally about to be revealed. Amara, standing beside Adrian, was still trying to maintain control, shouting at the crowd to stay focused. But Adrian's focus had shifted. His eyes were locked on the man's faint smile. He had seen that smile before. It was the same one the man had worn the night they had last spoken years ago. It had been a conversation about change, about the future. But back then, Adrian had misunderstood. He had thought the man was on the same side, fighting for the same cause. The tactical unit had broken through the crowd's defenses, their shields crashing into protesters. The sound was deafening, but Adrian could hardly hear it over the pounding of his own heart. The fight for justice was no longer just about standing up. It was about survival. The unit advanced further, pushing people back, and Adrian felt a deep urge to run toward the front, to fight back. But he couldn't. There was something far more pressing at play now. The man. As if reading his mind, the man turned his head slowly, meeting Adrian's gaze with a knowing look. Adrian moved toward him, pushing past a wave of panicked protesters. "What do you want?" Adrian's voice was sharp, cutting through the chaos. The man's smile only grew. He stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "I'm here to finish what you started, what you failed to finish." The words hit Adrian like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what the man meant. Years ago, they had made a pact to take down the corrupt power structures in place, to fight for a better future for the people of the Black City. But somewhere along the way, Adrian had begun to question the man's methods. He had been willing to fight, but not to destroy. He had wanted change, but not at the cost of everything else. The man saw the doubt in Adrian's eyes and gave a short laugh. "You've been soft, Adrian. You've been trying to keep everyone safe, trying to protect them from the truth. But there is no safety without sacrifice. You know that, don't you?" Before Adrian could respond, the man snapped his fingers. At that signal, a group of masked men emerged from the crowd, moving with quick precision. They weren't part of the tactical unit. These men were different. They wore plain clothes, blending in, but their eyes were cold and focused, and their movements were calculated. They spread out, taking positions around the perimeter of the gathering. Adrian's stomach twisted in knots. These weren't just thugs looking to cause trouble. They were professionals. And they were working with the tactical unit. The sudden realization hit him with full force. The chaos had been planned. The broken glass, the barricades, the violence, it was all part of a strategy. A strategy to crush the movement, to silence the voices demanding change. And the man in front of him, the one he had once trusted, was the mastermind behind it all. "You are behind this," Adrian said, his voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. The man nodded. "I've learned something, Adrian. People don't listen to words. They listen to force. You have to show them power, or they'll never respect you." Adrian's mind raced, and for the first time in years, he understood the man's true intentions. His vision for change wasn't the same as Adrian's. He was willing to burn everything down, to destroy it all, just to build something new from the ashes. But Adrian had always believed there was another way. "Not like this," Adrian muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't the way." "You're too naive," the man said with a sneer. "The world doesn't change through hope. It changes through action, through the strong." The sound of gunshots rang out again, this time closer. The crowd was breaking into a full panic now. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus remained on the man. He had to stop this, or everything they had fought for would be lost. Amara's voice broke through the noise, calling to Adrian. "We need to go, now." Adrian didn't want to leave. He couldn't, not when everything was falling apart. But then, just as the tactical unit closed in on them, the unexpected happened. The sound of a horn blared from the distance, followed by the unmistakable roar of an engine. Adrian's head snapped toward the source of the sound. A convoy of Black City residents, far larger than the one that had arrived earlier, had arrived in force. This wasn't just a handful of people, it was an army. Their trucks, cars, and bikes rumbled through the streets, barreling toward the community center with a single purpose: to protect their own. The tactical unit paused for a brief moment, caught off guard by the sheer numbers of people charging toward them. It was the opening Adrian needed. He turned to Amara, grabbing her hand. "Let's move," he shouted. Together, they pushed their way through the crowd, heading toward the edge of the community center where the reinforcements had just arrived. But as they moved, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. They had been duped, manipulated by someone they had once trusted. The man's smile lingered in his mind, unsettling, cold, knowing. Just as they reached safety, Adrian looked back toward the front lines. The man was gone, but his influence remained, hidden in the shadows of those who were willing to fight with any means necessary. Adrian knew, deep down, that this fight wasn't over. The city, the movement, the people, they had won this round. But the true battle for the future had only just begun, and there would be no going back from here. The choices they made now would shape the world for years to come. The final twist wasn't just about the man's betrayal, it was about the choices they had yet to make. The revolution was in their hands now. Adrian stood at the edge of the crowd, the roar of the engines still ringing in his ears as he watched the last of the convoy members disperse. The tactical unit, now vastly outnumbered, had been forced to retreat. For the moment, they had won. The streets of the Black City, once again, belonged to its people. But despite the small victory, Adrian knew better than to think it was over. The fight for change was just beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, shouting their triumph, Adrian felt the weight of the man's betrayal sinking in deeper. The city was safe, for now, but the forces that had orchestrated this chaos would not rest. The man who had once been a friend, a partner in this fight, was somewhere out there, watching from the shadows. Adrian couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning of something much darker. He didn't know what the man would do next, but Adrian was determined not to let him win. He turned to Amara, who had been quiet for a moment, scanning the crowd. Her face was flushed with victory, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. The weight of leadership had not escaped her. Despite the cheers and the overwhelming sense of achievement, she knew the people were counting on her to steer them through what was coming next. And that was something no one could prepare for, not even her. "We've made it through today," Adrian said, his voice low, steady. "But it's not over. We need to be ready for what comes next." Amara nodded, her gaze distant for a moment before she focused on him. "You're right. We can't get complacent, but we can't keep fighting in the dark either." She paused, then added, "This isn't just about fighting the tactical unit. It's about taking down the systems that protect them. We have to change everything." Adrian knew she was right. The fight had never been just about standing up to one enemy. It was about breaking down a corrupt system that had been in place for years. It was about rebuilding from the ground up. But how? The answer wasn't simple. The people had been divided for so long, manipulated by those in power to fight each other, to fear one another. It wasn't enough to just win the battle. It was the war that mattered. As the last of the crowd dispersed, Adrian and Amaro made their way to a small building at the edge of the square. It was their makeshift headquarters now, a place where they could plan the next steps, and perhaps most importantly, where they could regroup. Inside, a few familiar faces were already waiting, including their trusted allies from the Black City. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee and the quiet hum of people talking strategy. Adrian took a seat at the small table, running his hand through his hair. "We need to regroup. The tactical unit may be gone for now, but we've only seen a small part of what's coming. If we want to take this fight to the next level, we need more than just protests." Amara sat beside him, her expression determined. "We need allies, more people on our side, but we also need information. Who's really pulling the strings behind all this?" She looked at Adrian, her eyes narrowing with resolve. "I think we both know it's not just the tactical unit. It's the people in charge, the ones who think they can control everything." "I agree," Adrian said, his voice steady. "And we need to be smart about it. We can't rush in and make reckless moves. We need to strike where it hurts the most, disrupt the system without giving them a chance to regroup. The team around them nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had fought together for so long, and now they were ready for the next step. But even as they made plans, Adrian couldn't shake the thought of the man, his old partner. He wondered where he was now, what he was plotting. Adrian knew one thing for sure: this battle had taken on a new dimension. It wasn't just about the Black City anymore. It was about everything they had built, everything they believed in. As the days passed, the momentum from the rally started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. The city was quieter now, but Adrian knew that beneath the surface, tensions were rising. The forces working against them were regrouping, consolidating their power. But in the hearts of the people, a spark had been lit. They had seen what was possible when they stood together, when they refused to be silenced. Amara had worked tirelessly to build new alliances, to reach out to groups from all walks of life. She had a way of making people believe in something bigger than themselves, and slowly, more voices were added to their cause. But even with these new allies, there was a lingering fear, a fear of what might come next. It wasn't just the threat of more violence. It was the fear that they might not be able to sustain the momentum. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But the choice had been made. And then one evening, just as Adrian was starting to lose hope, something unexpected happened. He was walking through the heart of the Black City when a familiar voice called out from behind him. It was the man. The one who had betrayed him, who had set all of this in motion. "You've come a long way, Adrian," the man said, his voice cold and detached. "But you're still blind to the truth." Adrian's heart stopped for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. "Why?" he asked, the word barely escaping his lips. "Why all of this? You knew we could do better together." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you've won, but you haven't. All you've done is delay the inevitable. You can't change things from the inside. You have to tear it down completely." Adrian shook his head, the weight of the man's words sinking in. This was the final test, the moment when he would have to decide what kind of future he wanted. He could feel the pressure of it all, the weight of his choices hanging in the air. But in that moment, Adrian knew something. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the true power lay not in destroying what was, but in building something new. Something stronger, something unbreakable. It wasn't about tearing down the system. It was about creating one that served the people, not the powerful. It wasn't about violence. It was about vision, unity, and resilience. Adrian took a deep breath and turned away from the man, walking toward a new future. He had learned the hard way that change couldn't come from a single person's fight. It had to be collective. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Adrian knew the revolution wasn't just coming, it was already here, and it would endure.